I bought the house, I thought I was getting a good deal. It was a small two-story place on the edge of town, right where the asphalt thins out into gravel and the trees start pressing closer to the road. The real estate agent kept calling it a fixer-upper, but to me, it was a chance to start over. I'd just come out of a long, bitter breakup, and the idea of peace and quiet felt like something I hadn't had in years. It was old, late 1940s, maybe earlier, and you could smell the age in it. That sour scent of damp wood and stale air hit me the moment I walked in. I told myself it just needed a good airing out. The basement was the first thing I noticed. The door sat right off the kitchen, narrow and painted the same dull green as the trim. The steps were steep and uneven, the kind you could feel sag beneath your weight. I went down there only once when I moved in, just long enough to check the breaker box and note the cobwebs. The air felt heavier down there, thick and cold, and there was this faint, earthy smell, like wet soil. But it wasn't unusual for an old house. I figured I'd clean it later. The first few nights were fine. I slept light, mostly because every creak of the floorboard sounded amplified when you were alone. Around the third night, I started hearing something different. A low hum, not mechanical, but faintly rhythmic. It came from beneath the kitchen floor, like someone softly breathing under the planks. I thought maybe the old furnace was rattling, or air moving through pipes. I told myself it was just the house settling. You say things like that to keep yourself from thinking too hard. But then the light started. It was a dull yellow glow, barely noticeable at first, flickering under the bottom edge of the basement door. I only saw it because I was up late scrolling on my phone and the kitchen was dark except for that small breathing light. It wasn't steady, it pulsed faintly like it had a rhythm. I thought maybe I'd left a bulb on down there, so I opened the door to check. But the basement was pitch black, the kind of dark that eats the light from your flashlight. I flicked the switch at the top of the stairs, nothing. The bulb must have burned out. Still, when I shut the door again and went back to bed, I could have sworn I saw that faint light leaking out from the gap once more. Over the next few days, it became a pattern. The glow would appear only at night, only when the house was silent. Sometimes I'd stand in the kitchen just staring at it, that faint pulsing amber light. I thought maybe a neighbor's security light was bleeding in through a window, but there were no windows facing that direction, and the basement itself was underground on 3 sides. It shouldn't have been possible. I tried to ignore it, but the human mind has a way of gnawing on what it doesn't understand. I started sleeping less, waiting for it, testing when it would appear. Some nights it wouldn't. Other nights it would pulse for hours, steady and calm, like a living thing breathing under the house. The night I decided to investigate it properly, the air felt off, charged somehow. The crickets outside had gone quiet, and even the wind had died. I grabbed a flashlight and went down those creaking steps, every board moaning under my weight. The smell hit me halfway down, wet earth and something metallic like rust. The beam of my flashlight caught on cobwebs and dust motes, but nothing else. No lamp, no glow, just that quiet hum in my ears. When I turned toward the stairs, I noticed something odd. The paneling beneath the steps, thin wooden boards nailed into place, looked newer than the rest of the basement. Lighter wood, smoother grain. Someone had replaced it recently. The light I'd been seeing seemed to leak from behind that panel. I ran my hand along the edge and felt a faint warmth. My heart started thudding. I fetched a screwdriver from the tool bench and started prying the boards loose. They came away easy, almost like they were meant to be removed. Behind them was a small hollow space, maybe 3 feet deep, 5 feet wide. The soil inside was dark and fresh, recently disturbed, and sitting right in the middle of that space was an old lantern. The glass cracked and the metal blackened with age. But it was lit. I swear it was lit. The flame was steady and bright. No flicker, no smoke, just burning like it had been waiting for me. I froze. The heat coming off it was real. I could feel it on my face. And right beside the lantern was something half buried. A pair of work boots, soles sticking out of the soil like someone had been buried there upside down. The leather was old and cracked, the laces gone. I backed up, nearly tripping on the stairs. My flashlight slipped, and in the scramble, I knocked the lantern over. The light went out instantly, not dimmed, not flickered, just gone, like it had never been there. I ran upstairs, slammed the door, and called the police. They came out with shovels. 2 officers from the county sheriff's office. I told them exactly what I saw. The lantern, the boots, the freshly dug dirt. They didn't say much, just looked at each other like they'd heard this kind of thing before. One of them, a grizzled older guy named Fields, asked how long I'd owned the house. I told him 2 weeks. They went down there for almost an hour. When they came back up, their boots were caked in mud, and their expressions had gone flat. "There's nothing down there," Fields said. "No lantern, no boots. Ground looks packed solid. You sure you weren't seeing a reflection?" I told him no. I told him I'd felt the heat. He just sighed. "These old basements can play tricks on you. Gas leaks, bad wiring, mold spores. Mess with your head." They left it at that, told me to call an electrician, maybe a home inspector. That night I sat in the kitchen until dawn, staring at that basement door. No light appeared, no hum, just silence. But the next morning when I went to pour coffee, I noticed muddy footprints leading from the basement door across the kitchen floor. Prints that weren't mine. I followed them to the back door, where they simply stopped. No smudge on the handle, no sign of anyone outside. Over the following week, small things started to change. The air in the house grew heavier, damper. I began smelling that same wet earth scent upstairs. My sleep turned shallow and restless. Every time I drifted off, I'd dream of standing at the top of the basement stairs, watching that faint glow pulse like a heartbeat in the dark below. By the end of that week, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the local library, hoping to find old property records or something that could explain it. The house didn't have much history on file, no major incidents, no renovations except a few done in the early 1980s. But one article caught my eye. It was from 1979, a small piece in the local paper about a man named Caleb Mercer who'd gone missing. They'd last seen him working construction on the edge of town, on a property that matched my address. The article mentioned a search party combing the woods and the property's old basement, but nothing was ever found. When I read that, something cold sank into my stomach. That night, the glow came back. It was brighter this time, bleeding up through the cracks in the floorboards. I could see it even from the living room. I sat there frozen, every instinct telling me to leave, just walk out and never come back. But some part of me needed to know, needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed my phone to record and opened the basement door. The air that came up was thick and cold, like the breath of a cave. The light pulsed steadily now, coming from beneath the stairs. When I stepped down, the smell hit me again, soil and rust and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. My hands shook as I reached the bottom. The paneling beneath the stairs was gone, torn away. The hollow space yawned open again, the dirt freshly turned. The lantern burned bright and steady, and the boots were still there. Only this time there were legs attached. Denim, faded and stiff, led up into the soil until it disappeared. My breath hitched. The lantern flickered once, and then I heard it. A muffled groan, low and wet, coming from under the dirt. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pipe, the flashlight clattering out of my hand. The lantern's light dimmed and flared, and the dirt began to move, slow at first, like something shifting beneath it. Then a hand broke through. It wasn't skeletal. It wasn't rotted. It looked fresh, damp with mud, nails packed with soil. The fingers twitched, grasping at the air. I bolted up the stairs and slammed the door so hard the frame cracked. I didn't stop running until I was outside in my truck, hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove straight to a motel 2 towns over and stayed there for 3 nights. When I finally came back, the house was silent. The smell was gone. The air felt still again. I convinced myself I'd hallucinated it. Stress, mold, bad sleep. But when I walked past the kitchen, something caught my eye. The basement door was open, just a crack. And from that narrow gap, I saw it again. That faint yellow light, pulsing slow, steady, like a heartbeat under the floor. I don't go down there anymore. I've tried to sell the house, but every time a potential buyer comes for a showing, they leave halfway through. One guy told me he heard something moving under the stairs, like someone whispering. Sometimes when I sit in the kitchen late at night, I can feel it again, that low hum under my feet, that slow, patient pulse. Like the house is breathing with me, and every once in a while, when the night is still and the wind dies, I swear I hear footsteps, soft and dragging, pacing back and forth beneath the stairs, waiting. When I first bought the house, it felt too big for me. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and most of my family had moved out of state years ago. I told myself I'd rent out the basement for a little extra money, maybe help cover the mortgage. The space was finished but bare, one small window that barely let in any light, a low ceiling, and the faint smell of damp concrete that never quite went away. It had its own entrance from the side of the house, and that made me feel better, like I could have a tenant without it feeling intrusive. Ray was the first person who showed up. He was quiet, polite, maybe late 30s, though his face looked worn in that way that comes from long shifts and little sleep. He said he worked nights at a warehouse on the edge of town and just needed somewhere to sleep during the day. I didn't ask too many questions. I just wanted the rent coming in. The first few weeks were easy. I barely saw him. The payments came through like clockwork and the basement stayed silent. Sometimes I'd hear him moving around early in the morning, just as the sun was coming up. The sound of shoes on concrete, maybe a cupboard closing, but nothing strange. My cat Mabel didn't like him, though. She'd hiss whenever he walked past the kitchen vent, the one that connected to the basement's air duct. I figured maybe she didn't like his smell or the sounds he made down there. Then little things started going missing. My old wrench set from the garage, a flashlight, even the spare light bulbs I kept in a drawer near the laundry room. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I misplaced them. But then I started noticing other things. The faint smell of bleach would drift up through the vents in the evenings, sharp and chemical, mixing with something faintly metallic. I told myself he was just cleaning. One night I was washing dishes around 10 p.m. when I heard him talking downstairs. It was soft at first, like he was on the phone, but as I listened, the tone shifted. Quiet, gentle, like he was comforting someone. I heard the words, "It's okay now," and then silence. I hesitated, wondering if I should knock, but decided against it. Maybe he just had a guest. A few nights later, I woke up to a low hum coming from the vent near my bed. It was faint but steady, and it sounded like multiple voices whispering together. Too soft to make out words, but too deliberate to be random noise. I froze, straining to hear, and then it stopped all at once, like someone had pressed mute. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd dreamed it. The next time I saw Ray, it was in passing. He came up from the basement entrance carrying a bag of trash. His face looked pale and hollow, and he smiled at me. That thin, tight smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Everything all right down there?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He paused for a second before nodding. "Yeah, just keeping things tidy." But that smell lingered again after he left. Bleach and something else. Something that reminded me of iron or blood. 2 nights later, Mabel disappeared. I searched the whole house, calling her name, shaking her food bowl, but she was nowhere. I left the basement door closed. I didn't think she'd go down there, not with how she avoided it. Still, something in me twisted with the thought. The next morning, I asked Ray if he'd seen her. He said no, his voice flat, uninterested. That night, I dreamed of Mabel scratching at the basement door, crying to get out. I woke to the faintest sound, a soft, dragging noise below me. The hum returned through the vents, layered and distant. I pressed my ear against the metal and heard it clearly this time, whispering. Dozens of overlapping voices, all murmuring in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. My mouth went dry. I called out, "Ray?" The whispering stopped instantly. A second later, the basement door creaked open on its own. Just a few inches. I stood in the dark hallway, staring at it, waiting for something. A sound, movement, anything. Nothing came. I shut it tight and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. By the weekend, I couldn't take it anymore. I went down there when I knew he'd be at work. The air hit me first. Thick, humid, tinged with that chemical bite. His living space was small, a mattress on the floor, a table with a few cans of food, and a lamp with no shade. But the walls were strange. There were markings all over them, written in charcoal or maybe ash. I couldn't read them. They weren't in neat lines or letters, more like scrawls, looping symbols that looked like circles and slashes, almost like someone trying to record something they couldn't quite understand. The drain in the corner had a ring of rust around it. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't rust. It was darker, almost brown-black, like old blood. My stomach turned. I backed out fast, shut the door, and decided I'd talk to him in the morning, tell him he needed to leave. But that conversation never happened. That night, Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone pacing under my feet. Slow, steady footsteps. I checked my phone, 3:12 exactly. I sat there in bed, frozen, listening. The steps went back and forth across the concrete, deliberate and unhurried. I yelled his name once. The steps stopped. Then, after a few seconds, something tapped against the vent. 3 slow knocks. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I'd decided I wanted him gone. I went down there to confront him, but the basement was empty. The mattress was soaked through with some kind of fluid. Water, maybe, or something worse. The markings on the walls were smeared and the table was overturned. His bag was there, but the clothes inside were shredded. That's when I saw it, the patch of concrete in the far corner. It looked fresh. The surface was smoother than the rest of the floor, and there were faint smudges, like something heavy had been dragged across before it dried. The smell of bleach was strongest there, sharp enough to sting my eyes. I backed out and called the sheriff's office. 2 deputies came, looked around, and asked a few questions. When I gave them his full name, Ray Hollis, they just looked at each other. One of them said, "We don't have anyone by that name renting this address." "You sure he gave you ID?" I told them yes, that I'd seen it, a driver's license, clean and real. They told me they'd check it out, but when they came back 2 days later, they said the license number didn't exist. The name wasn't in any record. The older deputy asked me how I'd met him. When I said he'd answered my online ad, his expression darkened. "You take that ad down," he said quietly. "Don't put another one up." After they left, I couldn't bring myself to go back down there. I covered the basement vent with tape and left the door locked. But the sounds didn't stop. Every night around 3:12, I'd hear the same pacing beneath me. Sometimes it would stop right below my bed, and I'd feel this faint vibration in the floor, like someone breathing against the boards. One night, I woke to a voice whispering my name through the vent. I sat up, holding my breath, the air cold against my skin. The voice came again, closer, softer. "Down here!" I didn't move. Didn't even blink. The next morning, I called the landlord who'd sold me the place. I told him what happened, that I'd rented to a man named Ray. The line went quiet for a long time before he said, "Son, I owned that house for 20 years. I never had a basement tenant. That space hasn't been rented since the flood back in '94. I asked what he meant. He sighed. "A man drowned down there. They said he was squatting in the basement when the old storm drains backed up. Sheriff's office pulled him out 2 days later. I had it sealed up after that, poured new concrete. I don't know who you let in, but it wasn't anyone living." When I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the floor vent. The tape I'd put over it had bubbled from the inside, like air was pushing through. I went downstairs later that evening to see for myself. The basement door was already open. The smell hit me before I reached the bottom. Bleach, yes, but also something else. Something wet and sour. The floor was slick. The patch of concrete in the corner cracked straight down the middle. I stood there, listening, and for a second, I thought I heard breathing. Faint, shallow, coming from inside the crack. I didn't go any closer. I left the house that night and stayed at a friend's place across town. When I came back the next day, the crack was gone, the floor smooth again, like it had never been disturbed. But that smell, that heavy mix of bleach and metal, still lingered. It's been months now. I don't rent the basement anymore. I keep the door nailed shut, though sometimes in the early hours I still hear it. The footsteps, soft and steady, pacing under my feet. Always at the same time, 3:12 a.m., sometimes. If I'm awake and the house is quiet, I hear his voice through the vent, whispering those same 2 words he said the first time I ever knocked on his door. It's okay. But the thing is, it never sounds like reassurance anymore. It sounds like an invitation. When I was a kid, I thought every old house made noises. I grew up in a farmhouse tucked deep in the hills of rural West Virginia. The kind of place where you could go weeks without seeing a neighbor and where the woods pressed in so close at night that the trees seemed to breathe. The house itself was old, probably a century or more, built with uneven boards and thick plaster walls that trapped the cold in winter and the heat in summer. My parents always said it had character, but to me it just felt heavy, like it carried more memories than it should have. Underneath that house was a root cellar. It sat behind a narrow door in the pantry, low to the ground, padlocked tight. My father kept a key on a ring hooked to his belt, and he never once let it out of his sight. I remember asking about it when I was 7 or 8. curious why we couldn't go down there. He told me the same story every time, that the cellar had flooded years ago and the foundation wasn't safe anymore. Ain't nothing down there but mold and mud, he'd say. But there was something in his voice, something too quick, too firm. That made me think it wasn't just about safety. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and the wind died, I could swear I heard faint sounds coming up from beneath the floor. It was never constant, just a creak here, a tap there. But once in a while, if I pressed my ear to the floorboards, I could hear what sounded like a single knock, spaced out slow, like someone was testing the wood from underneath. My mom would scold me if she caught me listening like that. Don't encourage it, she'd say, though I never really knew what she meant by that. When I turned 13, we had one of the worst storms I can remember. Rain came down in sheets, wind howling hard enough to shake the windows in their frames. The creek out back had risen so high it sounded like a freight train running through the holler. We lost power just after dark, and my parents lit a couple of oil lamps while my dad went out to check the drainage ditches. I sat in the kitchen, watching the water run down the window glass in thick, trembling lines. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a low, dull thunk from somewhere below my feet. Then another. Slow, deliberate, like someone knocking from under the house. I froze, listening hard. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The sound carried up through the boards right beneath the pantry door. I called out for my dad, but the storm drowned out my voice. I told myself it was just the wind rattling something loose, but when the next knock came, it was louder, sharp, hollow, unmistakably human. My chest tightened, and every instinct told me not to move. The rain outside roared, and then silence. When my dad came back inside, soaked to the bone, I told him what I'd heard. His face went still, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he told me to go to bed. When I pressed him again, he snapped, harder than I'd ever seen him. I said, "Drop it." I did, for a while. The next morning, when the storm had passed and the house sat in that strange calm that follows heavy rain, I went to the pantry to grab cereal. That's when I saw it, the padlock on the cellar door hanging broken. It wasn't cut or smashed. It looked snapped, the metal twisted out of shape. The door itself was cracked open just an inch, and from that narrow gap, a cold draft poured out. It didn't smell like mud or mildew. It smelled stale, like air that had been trapped for years. I called out for my mom, but she was still asleep. Something in me, curiosity, or maybe the kind of foolish courage kids have before they understand fear, made me pull the door open wider. The hinges groaned, and the cold hit me full in the face. My flashlight was one of those plastic ones with a sliding switch, and when I turned it on, the beam barely cut through the darkness below. The cellar steps were slick stone, glistening with moisture, and the deeper I pointed the light, the more the darkness seemed to swallow it. I should have closed that door. I should have left right then. But instead I crouched and started down, one step at a time, until the smell of the air changed, damp and metallic. The floor was solid dirt, compacted hard from age. I swept the light around and froze. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of short, straight lines etched into the brick, grouped in 5s like tally marks. Some were faint, half faded with age, while others looked fresh, the brick dust still loose around them. There were so many that they blurred together in places. Whole sections of the wall darkened by overlapping scratches. At the far end of the cellar, my light caught something else, a narrow opening in the back wall, about 3 feet high, just big enough for a person to crawl through. The edges weren't bricked or framed. They were dirt, clawed looking like someone had dug it out by hand. The tunnel stretched straight into blackness. I leaned closer, shining the beam inside, and the air that came out was so cold it made my eyes water. That's when I saw it, a faint shift in the darkness, like something moving just beyond the reach of the light. It wasn't fast. It was slow, deliberate, like a person crawling on their stomach, dragging themselves forward an inch at a time. I heard the faint scrape of something hard against the dirt. My mouth went dry. I whispered, "Dad?" But the word barely made a sound. The thing in the dark stopped moving. Then, after a few heartbeats, I heard it, a single knock. Not on the wall this time, but from deep inside that tunnel. One knock, then another. Then another. I ran. I scrambled up the steps, slipped halfway, nearly dropped the flashlight, and slammed into the pantry door so hard it bounced off the wall. I turned to close it, but before I could, the door slammed itself shut from the inside. The sound was so loud it made the dishes rattle in the cabinets. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. When I reached for the lock, it was already back in place, whole again, unbroken, like it had never been touched. My parents found me sitting there hours later, curled up against the door, crying and shaking. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but they wouldn't listen. My dad's face went white as I spoke, and my mom just kept saying, "You shouldn't have opened it. You shouldn't have opened it." They never mentioned it again after that. The cellar stayed locked, and the key disappeared from my dad's belt. For years, I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, some trick of the storm and a kid's imagination. We moved out when I was 16, and I left that part of my life behind. But I still think about it, especially when it rains. It's funny what memory does, how certain things stay sharp even when everything else fades. The smell of that cellar, the feel of the cold air on my skin, the sound of those knocks, slow and deliberate, echoing up from the earth. Last year, after my father passed, I went back to the old place. The new owners had turned it into a rental cabin. They were friendly enough, said the basement had been sealed off decades ago, foundation too weak to fix. When I asked if they'd ever had trouble with water or flooding, the husband chuckled. "Only when it storms," he said. "You can hear it in the floor, like the ground shifting." That night, as I stood outside under a soft drizzle, I swore I could hear it again. Faint at first, then clear. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The sound came from under the ground, deep and hollow, as if something down there was keeping count, something that had never stopped. I left before morning. Now, every time it rains, I wake up at 3 a.m. without fail. The air in my room turns cold, and if I stay still enough, I can hear it again, that slow, patient knocking echoing through the pipes, through the floorboards, through whatever's left of the part of me that still remembers that cellar. It always stops after 7 knocks. Always 7. And I can't help but wonder if that's how many marks were left unfinished on the wall and waiting for me to come back and make them whole.